So welcome everyone to the seminar of the Center for Mobile Wearable System Augmented Intelligence. The center is kindly sponsored by Nokia Bell Labs. This talk will be given by Alex Rogers. Alex Rogers is a professor in computer science in the University of Oxford, and he has worked at the intersection of AI, machine learning, and physical sensors. I follow him on Twitter, and my invitation came because I'm very, very curious about this AudioMoth project. I see lots of tweets related to how many groups in conservation are actually using the technology and are collecting data. So I'm sure it's really making a big difference in the world with this tool. And so I look forward to discover a bit more about the technology behind it. Alex.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So what I want to talk about is AudioMoth and sort of present it as a case study for developing low-cost open source conservation technology, and also maybe sort of emphasize the idea that trying to be using the idea of trying to be useful as a motive for research rather than just novelty. As computer science researchers, we tend to be driven by novelty, novel results in papers. And there's a whole lot of work that we can do that's sort of more driven by just trying to be useful to other communities, and that motivation is really what sort of drives the work in AudioMoth. And the work I'm going to talk about has sort of been done over the last sort of 10 years or so by a number of PhD students. So Davide, Andy, and Peter, all PhD students who have worked on this area. And Ruby and Al are now currently involved with AudioMoth, working on the sort of the next generation of the devices and the hardware. And so this work sort of dates back about 10 years ago now, where I was invited to an event at Oxford Zoology Department that was looking at exploring new technology for biodiversity monitoring. And the idea here was that about sort of 10 years ago, smartphones and apps on smartphones was the new technology, and there was a lot of excitement about what we could do with a smartphone in order to sense the environment. And the case study that we sort of started working on in that project was driven by this insect, which is the New Forest cicada. So this is the largest native insect in the UK. It's about 3 centimeters long, so it really is sort of quite a big insect. It's very rare. The only place it's really largely been found is in the New Forest, and so that was sort of quite convenient because at the time I was at the University of Southampton, and the New Forest is sort of right next door. But it's got this sort of interesting feature that it hasn't been seen in the New Forest for about sort of 20 years. So there were a few well-studied populations. The main researcher who was active in that area passed away, and the knowledge about where these populations were in the forest has sort of died away. And so either it's extinct or it's living somewhere in the forest undetected. And so we were sort of interested in that time at ideas around sort of social mobilization. So how could you use smartphones and web technology to incentivize people to do tasks? This was shortly after the DARPA Red Balloon Challenge, where DARPA had encouraged teams around the US to find 11 red balloons that were sort of moored in the US, and it was famously found by an MIT team in about sort of 24 hours. So we started to look at what would be possible to do something sort of similar, and there's sort of the rationale for this that the New Forest is sort of a reasonably small area, so about 24 kilometers square. Previously, there was sort of one person looking for this cicada in this space, but the New Forest is very, very well visited, so about sort of 13.5 million visits a year, which sort of reduces down to each of those visitors sort of checking a 6 meter by 6 meter square. Or if you can persuade them to go for a walk in the forest, you can, a 6 kilometer walk, you can get that down to sort of 13,500 visits. So that's sort of the number where you can sort of imagine that maybe you could cover a significant amount of this area with these sort of volunteers searching, if they had some technology to do that. Obviously, they're not going to cover the whole area, but you can potentially sort of cover a significant amount of this space. And perhaps the most interesting thing about the New Forest cicada is that it sings at a very high frequency. So its song is at about sort of 14 or 15 kilohertz. And that's pretty much at the limits of most adults' hearing. So most adults can't hear the cicada singing, but most children can. I couldn't hear it, but Davide could hear it. So it's right on that sort of cusp of as you go from sort of from your 20s to your 30s to your 40s, you stop hearing the cicada. But it is a very loud song. So the cicada sort of sings for about 30 seconds. It's a resonant tone, so it has a sort of a drum type membrane that resonates at this frequency, and it's incredibly loud. So this is the male sort of trying to attract a female, and so it's singing very loud and singing for a significant amount of time, typically only when it's sunny and it's warm. So there's a sort of a 6-week period every year where the cicada may be out singing. So we were interested in sort of automatic ways to detect that. And obviously there's sort of an interesting idea here that if you can't hear 15 kilohertz, then your phone certainly can hear 15 kilohertz. So we were interested in could we sort of use smartphones to automatically detect this insect. And it turns out that this is sort of quite a nice case study, because if you go back to when we were started, there weren't any examples at that time of people using smartphones to do automatic species recognition of say bird song. Now it's more of a standard approach, and there are sort of several apps that you can get. Going back then, this was sort of quite a new area, and actually the cicada is quite an easy thing to detect. There's not very much singing at that sort of frequency, and most of the other things that are singing have sort of quite different patterns. So this is a dark bush cricket, which is a scratching noise. So unlike the cicada, this is scratching its back legs together to make the sound, and obviously it has this sort of short pulse-like pattern, but also the signal goes much higher. It generates ultrasonics way past the sampling limit of the microphone. And then towards the end of the cicada season, there's another insect that comes out, which is Roselle's bush cricket, and this again is making this sort of scratching noise with lots of ultrasonics, but it is making sort of more longer period tones, which are sort of more similar to the cicada. And beyond that, there's not very much that you need to disambiguate. There's a little bit of wind noise and sort of background noise, but this is all sort of very much sort of within the remit of a simple sort of hidden Markov model, looking at a few frequency windows, with the sort of the extension to capture this sort of time period of the different songs. So what we developed going back about sort of 10 years or so was a smartphone app. And so this is the app sort of being tested in Slovenia, where the same insect lives. And what you can sort of see is that very strong sort of signal at 14 kilohertz, which is the white band. In a second, the cicada is going to stop singing, and you suddenly see the signal disappear. And whilst it was singing, the center button was sort of glowing to indicate that it's detecting this sort of cicada signal. And then we collect 30 seconds, and then we do a little bit of analysis, and we sort of decide that that's probably a cicada detected. And that really was a cicada detected. And so it turned out that this was amazingly effective for detecting cicadas. So the cicada is singing incredibly loudly, but me standing there holding the phone couldn't hear anything. Sometimes you can sort of hear it right at the end when the signal stops, and you realize that there must have been a noise, but you couldn't actually recognize it whilst it was singing. But this really did turn out to be sort of the most effective way of detecting the cicada. So we were there with the sort of the world cicada experts, holding our phones in the air, and doing much better than them with their sort of specialized hardware that they'd modified from bat detectors. So it really was this sort of vision of automatically detecting species around you, and it worked surprisingly well. What we realized as soon as Pokemon Go came out was what we should have done is turn this into a game. So we were asking people to go out into the forest and collect surveys for us. Over sort of 2 or 3 years, we had about sort of, I think probably about 30,000 survey reports uploaded. We didn't find the cicada, But it was very clear that people weren't going everywhere in the forest. So there were lots of spots where we'd have liked people to go and collect data on days when the sun was shining and there was very little wind, days when actually you had a very good chance of detecting it if the cicada was there, where people just didn't visit that site. So with a gamified interface, we might have been able to persuade people to go during those periods. But there was a lot of resistance to different stakeholders within the area. So even Pokemon Go suffered a lot of sort of conflict with people being encouraged to go and play in inappropriate areas. We had a lot of pushback from stakeholders in the area about sort of guiding people to particular locations. And so that really sort of set us thinking about, okay, so the smartphone approach is fine, but could we do something with sort of a static detector? So the nice features of the smartphone was that we could put an algorithm on the device which would detect the cicada, which would potentially avoid having to record continuously for extended periods of time. But we were still relying on people sort of carrying these devices into the field. So we started to look at what was available in terms of standalone acoustic recorders. And there are, in this area, there's a small number of commercial companies which produce these devices. So this is a Song Meter 2 from Wildlife Acoustics. And typically these are sort of quite big boxes, which are largely full of batteries. So the sort of standard model for a bioacoustic survey would be to deploy several of these. They're quite expensive. They're about £1,000 each, with enough batteries in them to make continuous recordings for about 3 months or so onto some large SD cards. And typically they're recording at sort of 48 kilohertz, or if they want to record bats, even higher at sort of 192 kilohertz. And then some poor DPhil student, PhD student or postdoc then basically has to sort of listen to the recordings and zoom backwards and forwards through them, trying to find things that are of interest. So the devices are potentially quite expensive. They're quite large because of the batteries. They're large because they record continuously, and that incurs this very high sort of processing cost, which is very sort of labor intensive. And so you can sort of automate a lot of that, but even just sort of handling and dealing with these sort of huge acoustic files begins to become a challenge. So even if you've got some approach to conveniently looking through and processing the audio, just managing the amount of data you get becomes a challenge very, very quickly. So we were looking to sort of see what we could do to replace these types of devices, and largely just sort of looking at, okay, well, what's inside these devices and what would we actually need in order to do something like our Cicada app, but actually in hardware. And what we eventually ended up with in terms of hardware is a device that we called AudioMoth, and it has some particular features which have evolved over time in order to sort of make it sort of easily to deploy. But I want to sort of talk a little bit more about sort of the hardware to start with. So this is typically a small acoustic recorder that uses a very low power ARM core. So we use an ARM M4F, so it has a floating point unit. And crucially, it's a microcontroller, so we can sleep it during acoustic samples. We write data to an SD card, and we have a very small amount of memory on board to act as a buffer, just largely to handle the sort of latency of SD card writes. So this is really sort of the minimal hardware that you could use. And the surprising thing is that sort of once you add up the sort of the cost of all those components, you know, the bill of materials for a device like this is sort of $10 or so. And then you look at sort of the cost of a commercial recorder, and it's sort of it's $100, it's $1,000 or so. And crucially, the advantage of sort of a small, low power microcontroller device is just the power consumption. So one of the key things we wanted to be able to do was deploy these devices for a significant amount of time. So a typical sort of deployment might be about sort of 3 months or so. The energy of writing to the SD card is typically the thing that consumes the most energy. So if you want to make this device small, and requiring minimal batteries and minimal SD cards, what you need to do is you need to put some sort of intelligence on the device. So you need to have the device itself making decisions about whether something is interesting and worth recording or not. And so that's really sort of the angle that we went down. We decided that if we could make this sort of device an acoustic recorder, but we could make it a smart recorder, we could make decisions on the device about what to record. And as soon as you do that, everything becomes a little bit smaller. The SD cards are smaller and cheaper. The battery requirements become smaller. Packaging, the whole thing becomes smaller. And you can basically then sort of use a low power ARM microcontroller and deliver the whole device very cheaply. So we developed these within projects for our own use largely. So this is the AudioMoth as we deployed it for the Cicada project. So we could basically take that hidden Markov model that we developed for the smartphone and run it on this device. So the device is sort of capable enough that we can do sort of a coarse fast Fourier transform in real time, or use sort of Goertzel filters to look for particular frequency bands, and then run a hidden Markov model to make decisions about does this signal look interesting. And so the Cicada project, we deployed this over 3 months. The device would wake up every 5 seconds. It would listen for 200 milliseconds. And if it thought that it was recording the Cicada, it would make a recording for the next 30 seconds. So that approach works very well for the Cicada, which is sort of a significant a signal of a significant length. And basically you can afford to wake up several times. And what you're really doing when you sort of try and tune those algorithms is tuning the false positive rate. So you have multiple chances to detect this Cicada, and basically we just want one detection. The challenge we have is the false positive rate. There are things in the environment that will trigger recordings. We have a certain amount of battery capacity, a certain amount of SD card capacity. So basically you end up tuning your algorithm to ensure that you're not going to make too many false positive recordings, and either fill up the SD card or flatten the batteries before you've been able to deploy it for a significant amount of time. So this was largely the work that the DPhil students were doing. So they were sort of developing the device and then working with other partners who were sort of deploying these in different places. And so we did some work with some colleagues in Africa who deployed a very early version of AudioMoth. We'll come back to me. You might notice that the components are on the other side of the board, and we'll come back to that in a second about sort of in terms of the hardware design, why that turned out to be useful. But they were sort of interested in recording, placing these devices up and down the sides of Mount Kenya, and basically sort of tracking the impact of climate change on where birds were actually sort of positioning themselves on the slope. So their sort of argument was that this was sort of the position that birds would sort of find themselves on the slope would be sort of an early indicator of potential movements due to climate change, as they could either go up or go down the slope to vary the typical temperature of their environment. So this might be a sort of an indicator of early sort of climate change if you notice sort of changes in these species. So this was sort of quite another sort of an interesting deployment that's sort of quite similar to the Cicada in the sense that we only had to detect one bird species, and we had to sort of detect basically a binary classifier to say, is this an interesting recording to make or not? And so some of the challenge in this space that now people adopt in terms of birdsong recognition is, well, can you recognize every single bird in a dawn chorus? That's still a very challenging task, but you don't have to tackle these sort of very challenging tasks to do useful science. Basically, if the research group could deploy these devices, they could detect calls where the bird was singing, and that was sort of useful data. And then the third sort of trial deployment that we did with other partners was with Zoological Society of London. So they were doing a deployment in Cuba, where they were trying to sort of find the foraging range of a particular bat. So this is the Cuban greater funnel-eared bat. It only lives in one place on this island. Only in Cuba, it only lives in one cave in Cuba. And they were interested in sort of how far it forages at night in order to sort of to think about sort of the requirements if they were going to sort of protect the area. How big a national park would you need around this cave if you're trying to sort of preserve the foraging range of these bats? So these were projects that we did with partners. The students also sort of worked with a group at the University of Southampton who were working in Belize. And so in Belize, one of the challenges in lots of areas is illegal logging. So they'll typically sort of find the evidence of some illegal logging after the fact. The loggers, whilst they're working, are typically sort of hunting to feed themselves. So they build these hides. They're shooting the wild boar as a source of food for themselves, and they're essentially sort of in competition with the jaguars that live in the forest. So they're not hunting the jaguars, but they're introducing themselves as a source of competition for food. So it impacts on these jaguar populations, and these are protected. So it's quite interesting and important for this group to sort of understand how often this sort of hunting worked, how often this sort of hunting was taking place in these protected areas. And so the project in that case was sort of looking at, okay, well, can we detect gunshots in real time with these devices? The gunshot challenge is a little bit harder because it's an impulsive sound. It doesn't last for quite so long, which has some requirements for how you power the device. So our cicada deployment was waking up, going back to sleep to conserve energy. You can't necessarily do that if you need to continuously listen for an impulsive type sound. So we had to engineer something with a larger battery, and then get into the details of, okay, well, what sort of housing could we use for this larger battery? And one of the challenges, which is sort of obvious to many conservationists, that was sort of wasn't evident to us at the start, was actually just the challenge of transporting this stuff into the field. So what we ended up with was using these sort of lantern batteries, which are available pretty much everywhere. And this is quite an effective alternative. We'll sort of talk a little bit later about sort of the challenges of transporting lithium batteries. And so using technology which is sort of easily available in the deployment country sort of turned out to be sort of quite important, something that we hadn't really appreciated at all when we sort of started playing around with these projects. And then the other challenge is sort of how do you house it? So this is actually a sort of an AudioMoth housing that's made out of some plumbing parts. And so this is the sort of the connector that typically connects your toilet bowl into the sewage system. So this has some very nice O-rings, which are very good O-rings because you don't want this to leak. And the nice thing about these is they're sort of completely ubiquitous. So you can sort of source these in any country. And so Andy spent a lot of time sort of coming up with this sort of laser cut acrylic design so that we could go to Belize and just take the circuit boards and just take this laser cut acrylic and then locally source the batteries and the housings and put the whole thing together in the field. And these are some of the devices deployed to collect some trial data. And this is an example of gunshots. So gunshots travel quite a long way in this sort of tropical forest. And again, they're sort of quite amenable to a relatively simple hidden Markov model because you find that different frequencies are stripped out at different rates as the sound sort of bounces through the trees. And so the signal processing on these devices so far is it has been sort of quite classical approaches. You can use sort of small hidden Markov models and run them on these microcontrollers quite easily. And so this enabled us to deploy devices which would essentially listen for 12 months continuously, hoping to hear a gunshot. And then if they did record a gunshot, recording that to an SD card the logging both the event and also the pure audio file. And that turned out to be sort of quite a useful data set. So it's the first extended data set in this area that sort of enabled researchers to understand just how often hunting was happening within this area. So previously, sort of no one had really sort of been able to do this this type of deployment, partly because the existing devices were too expensive. To cover an area, you need a significant number of them, and the commercial devices were just too expensive. But also because the commercial devices weren't aimed at doing anything smart. They were just aimed at recording continuously. And what you really need in many of these settings is some smart decision making on board the device. So at the end of this project, we started to sort of think about, okay, well, how do we make these tools available to other people? So these tools have turned out to be sort of quite useful to us. They turned out to be sort of useful for some of the partners that we'd worked with. We were interested in sort of approaches to sort of making the tools that we developed usable by other people. And a standard thing to do in software engineering is to make the source code open source, to put it all on GitHub, put it out there, and to hope that someone will come along and be able to use it. So we did that. But that really wasn't sort of sufficient. So one of the challenges that, whilst it's relatively easy to download software, well, I mean, often it's a challenge to download software and get it running. But compared to actually getting hardware running that you've downloaded designs for, it's certainly the software is much easier. So even though this sort of open sourcing the firmware and any supporting software sort of worked reasonably well, it didn't really sort of address this key challenge, is that people didn't really just want the software, they wanted the device. And so at the same time, I was working on a spin out, which was looking at developing some low-cost sensors for home energy monitoring. So this was a project called Julo that developed these little sort of USB sensors. We did a research project where we sent them out to homes. One of the sort of key insights from this project was actually that it's quite compelling to be able to put sensors in the post. If you want to be able to distribute sensors easily, being able to put sensors in the post and just post them to people means that you can sort of scale up research projects relatively quickly. So we did a project where we collected data from about 1,000 homes. And to do that, we manufactured 200 sensors. And so that assembly process turned out to sort of be quite sort of arduous. So we ended up sort of having to go to the factory in Malaysia, where we set up an assembly process. The sensors that we designed for this Julo project required some hand assembly. They needed the PCB board to be assembled, which is a relatively sort of straightforward process, but then they required the sensor to be put inside a housing. And that required some sort of production line, and it required some sort of training of the people who were doing it, and some sort of testing of the device afterwards. And then for us as researchers, actually using those sensors and sending them out actually required sort of quite a lot of, I won't call it drudge work, but we spent a lot of time folding up boxes and putting boxes in the post. It enabled us to scale this experiment, and eventually Julo was acquired by a Dutch energy company who wanted to use it as a way of collecting energy data from people's homes. So the idea was sound, but it required sort of quite a lot of work for ourselves, and it wasn't clear that type of approach would really scale. So especially in a university setting. So in a university setting where PhD students are going to complete their course and go off and do other things, how do you sort of set something up that has this sort of easily, that has some sort of longevity and can sort of scale without requiring you to touch every single device? Given that if you just sort of put the designs online, that's just not sufficient. So we were really sort of looking for, okay, well, what is the equivalent of the app store in this space? And it's easy to forget now just how sort of how challenging it was to distribute software before the existence of app stores. If you wanted to distribute software, you'd have to hope that someone would find your website. You'd have to hope that they trust you enough to download it. And then you'd have to hope that they'd sort of come back again and check for updates when you sort of found some bugs and fixed them. Having app stores really completely changed the way that we could do participatory sensing. We could sort of build software apps, push them out to people, push updates to them, and get that data back very easily. And it's very easy to sort of to forget sort of how revolutionary that is. And as soon as you start doing sort of hardware projects, you realize that there is no alternative to that. There's no easy equivalent to that. So we started to look at what could we do that would make distributing hardware devices potentially as easy as it is to distribute apps. And we found a few companies which were sort of emerging in this space. One of them is really interesting, is a company called Circuit Hub. So Circuit Hub does PCB assembly. So if anyone sort of had some circuit boards assembled, what you'll know is that there's a sort of a standard set of files. So there's some standard files which describe the printed circuit board. There's a bill of materials that describes the components. And then typically there's some additional files, sort of pick and place files, which tell a machine the orientation of all those components, where to put them and what orientation to put them. And then the assembly of printed circuit boards is pretty much standardized. So you could send those files anywhere in the world and have components assembled. But if you go back a few years, that was sort of quite an opaque process. So you'd approach a sort of a PCB assembler and they'd ask for all these files and then they sort of give you a quote and you weren't quite sure what you were paying for. You weren't quite sure sort of how much you were paying per device, depending on how many devices you ordered. Circuit Hub, which we discovered at about the time when we were sort of launching AudioMoth as a tool that other people might be able to use, tried to sort of address this by in quite a revolutionary way by basically sort of just putting at the bottom of a web page 2 sliders. So you basically say how many boards you want and when you want them, and it would give you a price. And so you could break down the price. You could see how much of that price is coming from components, how much is coming from assembly, how much is the printed circuit board. You could understand how that price changes with lead time and quantity. And then you just click the order button and it asks you for your credit card. And then a little bit later, you get a big box with all the components, with all the assembled printed circuit boards in it. So this was sort of the first real online tool that really sort of made printed circuit board assembly transparent to the end user. Previously, it was a little bit of a sort of an opaque process where you were sort of typically negotiating with a supplier. And as soon as you don't have a visible price, as soon as you look at the page, it's a little bit off-putting. And the next sort of thing that we try to seek to address is that the Circuit Hub made it okay if people wanted to buy significant numbers. So we put AudioMoth designs on Circuit Hub. If people wanted to go there, if they wanted 100 devices, they could go there and order 100 devices. But typically people don't want 100 devices. They want to try it out. They want 2 devices or 6 devices. And so we started to look around about what else existed in this space. And came across Group Gets, which was just sort of founding at the start when we were sort of launching AudioMoth. It was all the timing was quite fortuitous. And so Group Gets aims to address this sort of scaling challenge of assembling bespoke electronics, where you get a good price if you assemble 1,000 devices or several hundred or 1,000 devices. But typically most people just want 2 or 3 or 4 devices. And so what Group Gets do is do group purchasing. And so they will allow you to put a group purchase campaign together on their website. People basically buy components, they commit to buying them. These devices exist. So it's not like Kickstarter where you're committing to hopefully get a device when the development process is finished. These are all devices that actually exist. Group Gets have all the build files. Basically, they batch together a large number of individual buyers, go to a PCB assembler, so a local PCB assembler based in Reno in the States, assemble those devices and then distribute them. And so along with Wild Labs and Aribada Initiative, we started selling AudioMoth in these group campaigns. And what we sort of discovered in that process is that there was a demand for low-cost devices. There had been equivalent sort of low-cost acoustic recorders that had appeared in the literature before. People had developed similar devices for their own research projects, but the challenge was that no one could ever really sort of use them in their own projects. In order to do so, they'd have had to download all the design files, find someone to go and build it for them, understand how to program it, and then eventually at the end of the day, use it within their research project. And typically these are used by ecologists who are interested in studying their particular environment or particular animal, and they don't want to get involved in all the sort of the engineering requires to put these things together. So Group Gets was really a sort of game changer for us. We suddenly sort of understood that there was sort of a demand for these devices that really sort of hadn't been served before, because The alternative was buying a commercial device. And also as a sort of a research project, it was sort of quite sort of extraordinary that we could design hardware, make those designs available, but then also facilitate people buying them. So rather than having to assemble them ourselves and ship them to people, we would do all of that through group gets and never actually touch the devices ourselves. So these devices were purchased by individuals, assembled in a big batch, and then shipped off to all these individuals around the world without us as researchers actually having to touch any of the devices. And clearly that sort of scale is much better. If you have to touch every single device, then that's a big disadvantage to how these sorts of projects scale. So why did AudioMoth sort of work so well, and what can we sort of take from it in other projects? So one of the key things is it's quite easy to use. So a lot of the projects that we do as researchers involve bespoke functionality. So typically we're interested in a cicada detection algorithm or a bird song detection algorithm for a particular species of bird. But actually there's a whole set of people who just want a acoustic recorder. And typically any of those sort of machine learning projects which involve you doing some sort of species recognition, they all have to start with getting library recordings. And so deploying devices and just collecting recordings with a range of different sort of scheduling tools turns out to be the sort of the minimal task that's sort of widely applicable and can be used by lots of different groups. And so we made that very easy to use. So we made it easy to configure the device, and crucially, we made it easy to update the device. So we sort of continuously update the firmware, and we're shipping this new firmware. And so we try to make it easy for people to update their devices. It's easy to buy, so group gets, and there are now some others that do a similar thing. They really enable this sort of low cost and low risk manufacturing. So one of the key aspects is that no one has to commit funds up front to pay for the assembly of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 boards. Basically, group gets will collect the money and then go and purchase the components and do the assembly. So the risk of building a huge number of devices which actually no one wants goes away. And so you can test demand for particular devices very easily without taking the risk of assembling thousands of them before and being left with them and then having to sort of dispose of them somehow. It's easy to transport. So this was a thing that we didn't sort of appreciate up front. We use standard alkaline AAA battery or AA batteries in AudioMoth. Most electronic devices that you buy will have a lithium battery inside them. But actually, when you get into the mechanics of actually trying to ship lithium batteries, it's very, very complicated. One of the key aspects, and we do lots of system science type projects with AudioMoth, where we just want to put the device in the post to someone. And so we can very easily post the device without any batteries and ask them just to buy some AA batteries to power it. And so being able to distribute easily is important. And that typically means avoiding lithium batteries. And so there are sort of some small sort of design choices that turn out to be sort of quite critical. And those need to be sort of considered up front. They sort of need to be considered at quite an early design stage rather than sort of trying to retrofit them right at the end once you discover that, oh, okay, well now we'd like to be able to send it in the post, and this lithium battery we've got is a challenge to that. It's quite flexible as a device. So we tried to sort of choose the minimum functionality that addresses the most applications. So the minimal functionality is just some scheduled recording, and we find a lot of people are using that for all sorts of different purposes. So during COVID, people were recording urban environments and doing sort of noise reduction surveys. There's a lot of people recording bats, and so there's a range of different applications, and trying to sort of find what's the minimum functionality that supports the most applications is quite important. It's good enough for purpose. And so one of the sort of key design features of AudioMoth is that the circuit is single-sided. We put all of the components on one side, and then in the assembly, it's basically sort of flipped over and a battery holder is hand soldered on, and that protects the device. And so there are some sacrifices in doing that. So having the microphone on the same board as the SD card generates a little bit of interference. That's not the way your phone is constructed. Your phone has the microphone on a flexible PCB connection to ensure that interference from the rest of the device doesn't get transmitted into the microphone. So we give up a little bit of quality for ease of assembly, and ease of assembly turns out to be the key thing. As soon as someone has to touch something, solder on a wire, anything that can't be done from a normal PCB assembly house, then someone has to touch these devices, and suddenly the cost increases. So PCB assembly of single-sided printed circuit boards is straightforward, can be done anywhere, and so if you can sort of design your device around that approach, it turns out to be very easy to manufacture it anywhere. And then the other sort of aspect is that it's quite extensible. So we do lots of more researchy type projects with research groups around the world who want to use AudioMoth. And in those projects, we sort of add the functionality. So we're interested in on-device machine learning. So looking at sort of using small scale neural networks rather than sort of traditional hidden Markov models to do this sort of recognition on the device. And that works reasonably well. You can run sort of small convolution neural networks. You have enough processing power to do a calculated spectrogram and then run a convolution neural network over that spectrogram to do species recognition or to do sort of simple interesting or not interesting recognition. And then we have some other projects looking at sort of satellite connectivity and GPS integration. And so the key thing that we sort of try to do in all of those projects is to use a standard AudioMoth and add things onto it. So it's very easy to think that, oh, well, we can just design a custom board for this application, and you can always design a custom board for that application. But actually, it tends to be sort of easier to try and sort of design a device that you can add things onto easily, and then just add additional devices onto it. And so AudioMoth now is sort of used. There's probably about sort of 40,000 of them around the world, being used for all sorts of different sort of research projects. The funding that sort of comes from that assembly has allowed us to do other things. So we have a case. So one of the key things that we didn't address with the very first design was, well, how are you going to package up this device? And it turns out that packaging of low-cost electronics is the real challenge. It's very easy to design a printed circuit board. It's very easy to have a printed circuit board assembled. Getting a housing designed and manufactured is much more of a challenge. Turns out that most of the challenge is in the plastic case rather than the electronics inside it. And so once we generated enough scale and we had enough interested people, we could sort of commit some to the cost of actually having that case designed. But it is sort of worth thinking about. Sort of in the early days, you've got a device that has to be deployed. Thinking about what you're going to deploy it in right at the start is really important. So we always designed AudioMoth to be deployed in just plastic bags, which would be fine for short-term deployments. And they are used by many groups around the world just in Ziploc bags, and they work very well. But there are groups using them for much longer, sort of one-year deployments where you want a more robust housing. So eventually we had to address that. And we're also sort of working now on smaller form factors. So Ruby, who sort of is on the slide at the front, she's been working on this device that we call MicroMoth, which is basically sort of completely equivalent to AudioMoth, but just smaller. And this has some challenges. So it's a double-sided printed circuit board. The assembly tolerances are much more precise. The assembly process isn't quite so straightforward as soon as you have a double-sided board. So there are some sort of trade-offs, but potentially there's enough people interested in a small-scale device, particularly on putting the device actually on the species of interest. So we're working with a group at the moment in Africa doing wild dogs, and they hope to deploy AudioMoths actually on the device and eventually try and detect panting of the dogs in order to do some sort of energy assessment, so how much energy are these dogs expending as they go about their lives. So I'll leave it at that. So I want to leave some time for questions. There are some publications that describe the work and the electronics, but I'll just refer you, the best place to sort of find this information is on the AudioMoth website, which is openacousticdevices.info. So if you follow that link there's sort of links to examples of it being used and all the technical details of the device. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Fascinating. We can have some questions in the chat. Okay, I see there's already one, so I'll try to read it. It's from Fahim, who is thanking you for the presentation, which he found very interesting. Could you please comment on how to parse such large-scale ubiquitous data, for instance, labeling the samples or analyzing generic soundscape?
Yeah, you know, so most machine learning projects always start off where here's the data set, and actually in most of the sort of the projects we've been working on, actually getting that first data set and labeling it is the real challenge. And so there are some sort of communities who are further along than that. So back detection is sort of quite a mature field. So there's lots of sort of automatic approaches to back detection. Back detection can be done sort of quite well because there's very little background noise and the signal is very strong. And so there are sort of classic recognizers for that. People are sort of interested in developing some neural network approaches to try and sort of do this back classification. And then there have been sort of quite large scale Zooniverse citizen science endeavors just to try and label data sets. And so Kate Jones at UCL, she had a big project on Zooniverse, which used citizen science volunteers to try and label recordings in order then to train a neural network. So collecting that initial training set is always a challenge. For the Cicada project, we only had one recording. So the British Library had a recording of a cicada from the New Forest. And if you paid them £50, they would go and take that reel-to-reel recording off the shelf and digitize it for you. And so it wasn't until we went to Slovenia and actually recorded the same species ourselves that we could generate enough recordings to do anything other than sort of very sort of traditional approaches, just by sort of manually sort of picking features. So it's definitely sort of collecting labeled data sets is definitely the challenge. And most of the projects that we work with, they sort of come to us saying, well, we want to do some automatically detect this species. And then the first step is, okay, well, we need to deploy some devices that are just going to record and generate some data sets that we can then label. And typically that labeling is done by hand.
Okay, we have another question from Pascal Hirsch, who is using already AudioMoth for BATS recording. And he's asking if the machine learning software will be open as well, and the AudioMoth models will be open hardware, and the trained models.
Yeah. So we have a project we're working with Edge Impulse at the moment. So Edge Impulse is sort of quite an interesting company where they're trying to develop tools to enable you to train neural networks that run on small microcontrollers. And they have a lot of online. They have a sort of browser-based framework that allows you to upload training data, label it, and then train a small model, and then download that model or download some source code. So what we're doing is we're trying to make an easy mechanism where you can use AudioMoth to make recordings of your target species. You can then use Edge Impulse tools to train a neural network to automatically detect that. And basically, we're interested in sort of a binary classifier. Yes, that's interesting, I should make a recording, or just no, I won't. And then you can download that model, put it on the SD card, and then a version of the AudioMoth firmware will load that model and apply that model. So we're working with a group in Australia at the moment to do a night parrot, which was a very rare bird. It was rediscovered just a couple of years ago, but it basically sort of sings at night. And what they want to do is sort of automatically have some detectors that they can deploy easily that will automatically detect the song of the night parrot and make recordings if they hear it. And so the aim in a lot of this.
Oh, I think we might have lost our speaker. Well, I think I'm glad we lost him now, because the talk is already finished. So I think perhaps you can direct your questions by email to the speaker, and we'll end the seminar here. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.